Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name's Don Robinson, and welcome to SM Advanced Forum, streaming about streaming, your monthly live podcast or vodcast or whatever you call it. We could even debate that during the session, I think. But your monthly live update on the news and latest industry developments in and around the streaming industry. I am, as always, I hope, joined by my erstwhile co-host, Tim Siglin. Tim, are you out there?
I am out here, and as you can I'm still sitting in front of the globe.
Brilliant. Well, now, those of you with sharp eyes will notice that the technology is doing some slightly strange things because, unlike my normal many hours of advanced planning, I have managed to almost universally leave things to the last minute this week. But we maybe come back to that in a little bit. But what have you been up to for the last few weeks then, Tim?
Oh goodness, been doing a little bit of work, a little bit of vacation. Actually, getting ready to work on a survey project for the state of the industry, which should be presented sometime around Streaming Media West. Streaming Media, of course, does a number of surveys throughout the year. That one looks really interesting. We may do another one on personalization of ads, but that'll be a bit further down the pipe. And really, because this is a holiday here in the States, this is the first day I've really had a chance to sit and breathe. But later today, I think I'm supposed to go blow things up at Michelle's family's farm. So.
Any sneak previews on the state of the industry then?
The industry seems to be doing okay. The question is, wrapping our arms around it. When you say how big is the industry, what's the market sizing? There's so many moving parts, and in fact, one of our guests today, Peter, actually works in an area that I hadn't even really considered about thinking for sizing, but I may have to do that.
Well, there you go.
I guess I'm going to let you hit a little.
That's a perfect segue. Why don't you introduce find out who our first guest is?
All right, fantastic. And actually, we'll do ladies first. So, Florence, tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your company, and sort of how long you've been in the stream space.
Hi there. Yes, my name's Florence. I work at Themba, a startup here in Toronto that does basically we do all that piping from encoding to getting to the app for those wanting to get into streaming or already in the industry and looking to work with someone new. I've been working in the industry I've always kind of been in media, TV, and I've been in digital and OTT for the past, I'd say, 3 to 4 years. So still kind of new, but also sort of at that point where you've been through enough things to have a firm understanding.
Absolutely. And of course, being in Canada, you have hockey as well as all the other sports that you rely on here.
Well, I mean, just won the NBA championship finals. That was huge. While people could watch it outside on our big screens, there were also, I think, Reddit contribute to quite a few streams as well. So.
Nice. I used to work in King City, which is just outside of Toronto there, Mississauga. So I miss it at this time of year. I don't miss it in the winters.
Smart man. Yeah. Smart man.
All right, Peter, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your company and what you've been doing.
Sure. Well, my name is Peter. I guess I've been in streaming, as Don would remember, since about 1998, which is a really super long time.
Just about right,
yeah. My company is Clip Corp IP, and what we do is we help rights holders protect their intellectual property online. So obviously, it's managing piracy and managing illegal or unauthorized distributions of major challenge, but that's what we do.
So let's go back to 98, because that's about the time that I joined. Of course, Dom's been around for all that time as well. What are some of the major changes? I mean, back then we had real video and audio. We had Microsoft Windows. Well, Windows Media probably wasn't even out at that point. But were there major issues back then like there are today in rights holder protection, or was it so?
Well, that's a top question, because the I mean, I come from a background in the TV industry where it was all about, satellite connections and super high bandwidth signals. And when pay TV came out, and they were trying to, squeeze the consumer for a bit more revenue, the whole question of conditional access systems emerged. And, companies like Nagra, Kadelsky, others decided that, piracy of set-top boxes was a problem. You had all that card sharing.
Right, exactly.
But the key difference, at least in my opinion, is that card sharing is pretty high skill, and even if you do it, you're maybe doing it one-to-one. You're doing it in incremental units. Where now, if you can source a stream, even on your iPhone or something, and you can cam an image, you can spread it to millions in no time at all for free. So the dynamics of the industry have completely changed.
Interesting.
In that respect.
I'd forgotten about the card sharing, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember like the P4 card. There were these cards that were working to make sure that it was unhackable, and of course it'd be out for 2 weeks, and then somebody would figure out how to replicate the card. So.
Yeah, and the whole concept of exclusivity that underpins a lot of pay TV activities.
Right.
I mean, to what extent is exclusivity really a reality anymore? I mean, that's a good question.
And in fact, we'll come back and talk about that topic a little bit about paywalls a bit later here. Dom, so you have control of the Flipboard. What are some of the topics we ought to talk through on this? And if you need to hit one of the buttons for a stinger, feel free to do that.
Yeah, let's go for it. Normally we hold on. Let's see if my buttons are even set up and working. This is one of those days today. I think it's. So the first little sting is for the sort of key industry news, and I think it actually followed a good question to circulate across the group here today is actually the very first one I put to you. What is the state of the industry? Is a nice broad topic to get things flowing. So Florence, Peter, what, having been in the industry for a while, what do you think the overall state of streaming space is at the moment? Have you got any general comments to get us going?
For me, I see a lot of excitement around it. I see a lot of broadcasters really excited to get that, what they're seeing as new tech. I know that you guys have been in the industry a lot longer and have seen it a lot more, but when we go out and we talk to broadcasters and news organizations, the excitement around this technology, around just the space is over the top. Everyone really wants to be able to get into the market and get there fast, because we all see how much it's picked up. But to Peter's point about being able to control, what's picked up by people, what's pirated by people, things like even the debates right now, that's a huge point that everyone hits home on, that how do we control once we've put it out there to the world? Absolutely.
So do you think DRM is doing the trick? And there's maybe that's a too tech for a general comment, but I don't know. But do you think digital rights management is a solution, or do you think it's a one of the artillery that sort of helps in the arms race?
I think it's part of the artillery. I think digital right management obviously is a big component, but things like fingerprinting and making sure that that we kind of have maybe a central repository where everything's coming from will help with that issue.
Peter, what do you think? DRM, good or bad?
Look, I think DRM is certainly a good thing. I think it is a arrow in the quiver, if you like. But I think the world has fundamentally changed because of the underlying structure of the internet. And, it is almost impossible to command and control it in the way that you can command and control a closed TV network. And that has certain unavoidable implications, some of which are great, some of which are more challenging. And I think if you look at the pricing of someone like a Netflix, and you consider that in comparison to the pricing of the more traditional pay TV operators, I think that tells you a lot. And it'll be really fascinating to see how successful Netflix are in trying to push their price point up, and whether or not that will be achievable if the content is not quite as exclusive as maybe it used to be.
And do you think? I mean, you know,
And I want
go
to
on,
add
Tim.
something.
Go ahead, Tim. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dom, and I'll come back.
So just on the you know on the sort of starting on the tech floor with the DRM issue, you know, I struggle to think that we're ever going to be able to print direct sort of dubbing of an image, screen capturing, or simply pointing a camera at a screen and so on. So I don't think piracy is something that we're going to technically be able to ultimately prevent. But I do think that over the last, certainly Peter, when we were launching some DRM platforms 15, 20 years ago and so on, it was relatively easy to just circumvent the technology, if indeed the technology wasn't just being obstructive rather than helping anyone's business model. But I think that those technical challenges have largely been overcome now. But I do wonder whether, you know, in the last 10 years, with the sort of rise of Netflix and the success of some of the bigger online streaming platforms, I think we've certainly in music, we've seen a drop away of piracy, the convenience of Spotify, the convenience of Apple streaming. Oh, you shake your head there, Peter.
Yeah, but Dom, no, but is that the reason that you're seeing a decline in the piracy levels is because people are no longer having to pay the same sort of money they were paying for albums and CDs. So if you look at the pricing model that's been adopted by Spotify, it's wildly different. So I mean, if you look at an industry that spends a lot of money on protection, which is the gaming industry. Okay.
Yeah.
It becomes like asymmetric warfare. So let's say you've got a team of 50 developers. Let's say they're all super smart guys or girls or whatever, and they wrap up this thing and then they release it, and the whole world of gamers who are interested in cracking the encryption generally manage it in about a day. So it's asymmetrical warfare. I mean, you know, the idea, I think the concept of total exclusivity and lock it down, I think it has a part to play, but I think it as a business model, the business model based on exclusivity no longer is especially valid. But that not everybody will agree with that.
So, well, I actually do agree with that, but I think I think that we see the industry oscillate from trying to break down the paywall, make sure that, you know, you can go to any provider and see any content, and now we're seeing the sort of Disney Netflix war emerging, and there's this idea that actually we can put the paywalls back up and balkanize this content environment and force people to pay for multiple subscriptions. Personally, I think they're going to struggle. I think that I'm not going to take out extra subscriptions. I might eventually have watched everything on Netflix and decide I'm going to ditch my Netflix and now I'll take out a Disney, but I'm not going to take out both. There's under any circumstances. So Disney's lost me as a customer before they've launched, because I'm many years from watching all of the Netflix content. I think there's a limit to the compelling content argument.
But I also think there was a recent comment that I read by somebody at Apple saying, you know, essentially customers do want the reason they're going to sign up for these streaming or OTT on-demand platforms is they want exclusive content. Now, whether that's exclusive from a studio like Disney, whether that's exclusive from something that Amazon's creating for itself or Apple's creating for itself, I think what's fascinating about Peter's comment is Netflix may be at the wrong point in the industry's sort of major inflection point here as Disney launches its own service to raise rates, because there's already a sense in the industry that Netflix is losing content because of the Disney platform that's coming up. Dom, you mentioned paywalls, and paywalls is a topic that I think was on our Flipboard. Talk a little bit about that real quick, and then let's have a discussion, because I went back to 2007 with a New York Times paywall for an article that I'd written for Streaming Media that I wanted to just bring up as we go through this process.
I'm just seeing if I can get the desktop share to work so I can share my Flipboard screen. There we go, that's come up there. So basically the article headline was, "The streaming TV sector still doesn't realise exclusives will drive users back to piracy." And the principle is that, you know, if you're like me and you've got a Netflix subscription, and a particular piece of content arrives on the Disney Plus service that I want, but not enough to go and pay the subscription, will I go and start seeking it? Seeking a pirate copy. I'm minded of the early DRM wraps around music libraries and how that made, if anything, that accelerated the sort of torrent and P2P environment in my mind. And I think I personally, I do think that there will be an increase in piracy for people who are not able to afford or not willing to subscribe to multiple platforms. But let's hear from the guests. What do you guys think?
Well, I have to agree. I mean, we all know Netflix is also losing The Office, which is its highest watched show in 2021. And I think people, while Netflix is great, there are certain things that drive people there. So I think we're going to see a fatigue for people trying to, do I want Disney? Do I want Hulu? Do I want, Netflix? And it's basically sending us back to the situation with cable companies. So I do think we'll see a fatigue, and again, the return to some more piracy.
Peter, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, the example that springs to my mind, which sort of illustrates it for me, is we've done quite a bit of work on pay-per-view boxing. And what you find, or what we found in that space, is that if you segment the customer market, you've got people probably of the older demographic who are not that computer literate or friendly often. I probably am the older demographic. Who will just pay whatever it is. And then you've got a younger group who are a bit more price sensitive and who are coming through the system who won't do that. And so you're seeing a sort of a split market developing. And I think that will only continue. So, I think there's going to be, the challenge is to stop illegal content becoming mass market. And I think that's as much an issue about the cooperation of platforms like Facebook and actually, the registrars and the various hosting and distribution companies playing ball in order to stop things. But I think that's perfectly.
So it's an interesting bifurcation that you mentioned, Peter, where it's, people who aren't technology savvy are willing to do this, though, pay the money that are technology savvy. And there seems to be a third group, and I remember to the World Cup a couple of years ago where there was a streaming company who had the rights in Britain to stream the qualifying games, if I remember correctly, and they had to put a cap because they had too many people attempting to watch. And then what you had was pubs actually getting laptops, streaming the games, and then projecting them onto screens or around the pub. Is that mass market, or is that just an attempt to, sort of drive community? And obviously in the television world, that's a fairly well-defined thing. You're allowed to do X, Y, Z and broadcast within particular environments. But in the streaming and OTT world, I don't necessarily sense that we have those sort of established legal models for that type of thing.
Well, I think that the legal stuff is fascinating because, I mean, the industry, the TV industry in particular, has not really embraced the internet because they've seen it as a threat, which it probably is, and streaming as a threat. So there's a lot of lag in terms of how these things are now done. But what you're now seeing, as you've referenced, is streaming, I think, is going to become the key backbone, if it isn't already, of media distribution. I mean, you can argue that YouTube is the world's biggest television company. I mean, I know people don't necessarily think of it that way, but I think in terms of audience,
Totally agree.
volume,
Yeah, I totally agree.
I think it's
and especially for niche content. I mean, not that the World Cup is niche content by any means, but if you think about collegiate sports or even high school sports here in the States, there's a point at which people will want to consume that. You're not going to have a massive market for it, but you're going to have a big enough market that the rights holders, if there are, well, rights holders at collegiate level, definitely, will seem to have to chase a thousand different ways that piracy comes about, as opposed to some of the major sporting events where it's a known quantity of how piracy comes about.
I mean, arguably, piracy is a nice problem to have. It shows you're interested in your content, right? So the question, though, is in the economics of the industry. So, I'm very optimistic that it will be resolved, but I have a feeling that it will be resolved really in the end through international cooperation. We have constant problems with people infringing, and constantly take the position, well, you've got to sue us to get us to tell you anything, which is really unhelpful. And why they would do that, I can't imagine everybody's time.
So WIPO handles things like copyright, and I think we talked about this a little bit before we started the show. What do you look at from a regulatory standpoint for OTT? Is it the World Trade Organization? Is it WIPO? Is it, how do we go about this to have a consistent regulation across the internet?
Well, I think for intellectual property issues, all organizations are WIPO and also the United Nations, because they're part of that, I guess. But that needs to be accepted. It needs to be accepted in legal frameworks of as many countries as possible, certainly from an enforcement point of view. So, I mean, I do think that the idea that everybody uses name, protection on their name, and you don't know who registered this URL and who registered that URL. I think all of that has got to be, obviously people can have a degree of privacy, but when something is happening that clearly shouldn't be, I think common sense tells you. I mean, for example, the idea that it took them so long to shut down and track the people who were doing those terrible things in New Zealand, I think most normal people would think was appalling, wouldn't they?
So why, like my question, like you said, common sense dictates that this is wrong and we should probably shut down. Why have such a hard time with it? I mean, given the vastness of the internet.
I mean, my opinion is only that it's. I think there's been some deliberate pushback from, shall we say, some of the big operators in the industry. And I hope I'm wrong when I say this, but I wonder if it's because they don't want to carry the cost of the monitoring they need to do. But the idea that, I mean, and this might be controversial, I've never bought the idea that a platform doesn't carry responsibility for the stuff that it carries. I just don't believe that. So that has some cost implications. I mean, if you and I publish a paper together and we wrote an article about someone that they really didn't like, we'd be in trouble. Yep. So, I think the same should apply, but obviously I understand that most people don't agree with that.
Just to play devil's advocate there, though, the stationer who sold you the paper on which that message is printed wouldn't be in trouble, though, which is the mere conduit argument from the telecoms point of view.
I don't. Yeah, but that argument, I think, is someone on YouTube has actually processed the data through their systems. So the idea that they're just a mere conduit in itself is ridiculous. I mean, they provided a search tool so you can find it. They promoted it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely, in YouTube's case, where they're creating the customer engagement platform, I think that's right. But I think for the underlying ISP and telco, I think there is an argument for mere conduit status. Anyway, that's a debate that's been going on 30 years.
No. I agree with that mere conduit status, but I think when someone picks up the phone who's got a position of authority with the police or they are, I think the ISP should be obliged to cooperate, not just say, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to take us to the House of Lords before we'll tell you anything.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I agree. I also think in an era where we've got companies promoting AI technologies that can create highlight clips automatically and can and can generate short form content from long form content by deep inspecting the video stream itself. I think we are at a stage where it should be relatively easy for a large platform like YouTube, like Facebook, to quickly locate the location of uploading, the location of distribution of content. These aren't technical challenges anymore. They are very much policy challenges, I think.
Well, and what's interesting too, if you think about it, is in the old days, when I say the old days, 10 years ago with peer-to-peer, the whole torrenting thing, the reason that some of those solutions worked was because they were disaggregated. There wasn't a central location where the files were stored, unlike the earlier systems like Napster and like that. I do wonder, as regulation kicks in, whether there would be a model that, as peer-to-peer is beginning to rise again in the streaming video world, whether there would essentially be an argument that could be made that a YouTube-like solution that merely provides a point for you to come and search for content, but the content is not distributed by YouTube, would then be able to argue that they're merely conduit. So I know we've had some attempts at that in the past. Peer-to-peer sort of died away in streaming, but it seems to also be rising as a technology here recently. So, Peter, you mentioned newspapers, and I mentioned the New York Times earlier. Back in 2007, eons ago in the streaming world, the New York Times had a gentleman by the name of Martin Nisholtz, I believe was his name. Nissenholtz. He actually was the SVP of digital operations for the New York Times, and he came and did a presentation to talk about why they were moving away from paywalls. Well, 2 years later, of course, they pushed back into paywall, and so that would have been the 2009 timeframe. In 2011, GigaOM wrote an interesting article that said that the paywall costs for the Times was roughly $25 million to maintain that paywall. This is sort of conjecture, but I suspect more of that, not all of that was the technology cost. I would imagine a part of that was a litigation cost as well. And is that something that companies have to factor as they're moving back behind paywall models, that their litigation costs would rise significantly, or is the assumption that litigation costs are going to remain the same, and that the paywall will bring in revenue to more than offset that?
Well, I think my answer to the question, which I hope is an answer, is that I think the fact of some kind of paywall, I don't think that's really at the heart of the debate necessarily, because I don't think all content needs to be free. Mm-hmm. I think some content is non-viable if you try and support it with advertising.
Certainly.
So I don't think that's the case. I think the issue possibly, though, is once you have your decision that someone's going to pay, do you charge $200 for the pay-per-view or the paper, or do you charge $3? And I think those two things are a world apart.
Very true.
So that's sort of how I see it, is that the idea of, I think the future of the internet, for people to make, because people in the end, the business models have got to work, mm-hmm. And some of them will need to have some sort of payment attached to them. I don't think Amazon would do terribly well if they gave everything away. So that's what anyway.
I'd like to chip in with something. I was having a conversation. This is a question to all of you. I was having a conversation with I won't name who and which CDN, but senior exec in one of the larger. Yes, being woolly here. One of the larger CDNs, and he was talking about the overall structure of the industry and how, as one of the cultural challenges that the traditional broadcast industries faced in adopting streaming, first of all, was the idea that they were going to move into a unicast cost model rather than a broadcast cost model, where when a piece of content traditionally used to get more incrementally more popular, it effectively became incrementally more profitable, because it didn't really cost them any more to distribute by satellite or by over-the-air transmission. Whereas that's a much more linear relationship in a streaming thing. It's not an unmanaged cost. Streaming is still profitable, but the reinvestment that's available and for successful content and so on is somewhat constrained compared with how it was in the traditional industry. And that they were suggesting that this was going to create long-term problems in terms of financing creative projects. Obviously, we're seeing Netflix, we're seeing maybe Disney, maybe Apple investing in new content bouquets and so on, or new content originals and so on. But they're very few and far between, and actually getting small content out into the public domain, getting an audience for new creatives, new producers, is actually much harder, if anything, than it used to be. It was a generalized comment that he made, so I'm not sure I'd be one to defend all of the points, but I just wondered if that spurred any thoughts from you guys, maybe in first-hand experience. I know, Peter, you work with largely with sports content and so on, and I think sports is probably has less value in its long tail and more value in the immediacy of the live event, which again changes the dynamic. But maybe Florence, maybe some of your partnerships and customers, maybe that's reflected in, or maybe you see the antithesis of that. I don't know. Do you see that there's structural problems with the available cash flow going into original content production, particularly at the small end of the market? Or do you think it's now wide open and actually anyone can go and just produce on YouTube and away we go?
No, I do see the struggle that smaller companies will have. Oh, my fire alarm's going off. Sorry, guys.
It's one of those Thursdays, isn't it?
Okay. Everybody's having trouble today. Well, I mean, obviously, Dom,
Tim, what do you think?
Two hosts away.
What do you think of that? Do you think?
Well,
do you think there's enough?
Yeah, I mean,
coming back.
Here's the thing, and Peter sort of talked to the fact that mobile consumption is the area that we all need to focus on. Mobile consumption gets us closer to a multicast model, or the potential of it, with things like EMBMS. But even so, the scalability of unicast to multiple towers, creates a price problem.
Oh, and there's a dark. Sorry, just to be techie at the moment. There's a misunderstanding about EMBMS. EMBMS isn't the same as a wireline multicast. Trim limitation in the EMBMS as well, which is
right,
which really doesn't enlarge the reach at the edge of the network. So, but there we go. That's my technical footnote.
Yeah, I mean, and it's about as close as we get to multicast. From covering a few handsets at a time, as opposed to having to do single unicast. Do I think unicasting is a problem that the industry needs to address? Absolutely, because like you said, OTA or satellite distribution doesn't matter if 100 people are watching or 100,000. There's no extra load on the network. Is that cost something that significantly impacts the cost of doing production? Probably not, because of the fact that you do have platforms like YouTube who have set pricing depending on the tiers of number of simultaneous views you have. Is it something that we'd need to deal with going forward from a standardization standpoint? Absolutely. And especially when we look at things like HBB TV and ATSC 3.0, where it will essentially be IP multicast from an over-the-air tower, that provides a potential competitor to traditional OTT that the broadcast industry can exploit to actually offer their service to some smaller niche content providers potentially. That's a long answer to your question.
Well, no, but it's all valid, I think. And Peter, are you seeing that the revenues on? I mean, you presumably, your frame of reference is going to be sport, but are you seeing that the revenues for pay-per-view boxing online or for events online are they going as far as covering the production costs? Are they actually a profitable business?
Well, it's fascinating. The bellwether statistic is, I don't know if you're into the vloggers, and there was a fight between a couple of chaps, KSI and Logan Paul, which you may have seen. It was live on YouTube. It was pay-per-view on YouTube. and they're both big YouTube stars. So it was at the Manchester Arena. It was sort of non-licensed, I suppose it was non-professional boxing. And it managed to do, I think, a million or so live, and then another 2 or 3, maybe a few more million sales on demand. Now, I think it was priced about £7. So that was a massive step forward to get that sort of volume of buy. But at the same time, you will hear nothing compared to the sorts of monies that Mayweather and McGregor are making on HBO pay-per-view, right? So there's still this issue, which is a difficult one for people in the streaming industry, which is that if you're looking at just in terms of dollars and cents, in certain circumstances for these sorts of events, the TV platforms just deliver more money.
Yeah.
And that at some point theoretically changes, but today it's not the case.
So, I mean, just to cite an example, we've got a twin channel. I've got a twin channel which is focused on drone racing, drone sports, and so on. And thanks to mythical drones appearing at Gatwick and so on, their audience figures have absolutely exploded. They've got about 120,000 subscribers on the stream on a subscriber basis. Subscribe to their free YouTube basis. And suddenly they started getting ad revenue, which was kind of, it kind of freaked them out. It's a bunch of guys who were streaming to traditionally, 50 or 100 people. Suddenly their audience has exploded, but they're actually only seeing $300 or $400 a month in terms of ad revenue, and it's not really even enough to pay them to do it. It's still a hobby project for them. And yet I think 120,000 subscribers. If SMAF had 120,000 subscribers and wasn't a little niche project that it was, I'd be really chuffed. But I would also be thinking, with that audience, based on what I know from the amount of people the amount of money that I've seen various streaming companies or publishers invest into doing webcasts and so on, I would be expecting with 120,000 subscribers to be seeing tens of thousands a month in terms of ad revenue. So if they're only seeing $400 or $500 a month, I can't see how they're going to grow to up their production quality, to drive that into the millions, to ever become a mainstream piece of content. And I think that hints at a structural problem at the low end of the market.
Mm.
So, Peter, I want to go back to one of the comments that you made about TV, making all the revenue, which is absolutely true. About probably 12 years ago, the president of HBO come and do a keynote at Stream Media East. And that was when HBO Go was launching. And he was asked from the audience during question and answer time, would you allow non-cable subscribers to actually buy a monthly subscription to HBO Go and watch that content? His answer at that point was essentially HBO Go is going to be 10% of his revenue. He didn't want to alienate the 90% of his revenue from the cable premium. But 3.5, 4 years later, suddenly they launched a completely separate subscription to HBO Go. And in fact, now, at least in the States, if you buy for your ISP, for your DSL connection or your cable modem connection, you get Showtime or HBO Go packaged, for $5 as a standalone. So you mentioned eventually it won't be the case with TV. What's your general sense, based on what I was talking about there, as to when the tipping point is reached that OTT provides equivalent revenues or enough revenues not to be considered cannibalizing, over-the-air broadcast?
Wow.
And I'm sorry that sort of put you on the spot, but when you said,
if I hadn't answered to that question, no, I think I think the driver for doing this from a TV company's perspective is they can see that the demographics of their audience are aging quite quickly, and they're looking to the future and they're thinking, I'll look at this on YouTube, look at the figures on other streaming platforms. So they know they've got to change, but they don't want to undermine their existing revenue too much while they're doing it. That's my opinion. I think in terms of timing, I I think because of the comments that Dom just made, which I think are bang on about the drone racing, which is that most of the high quality TV productions on a strict profit and loss basis couldn't be supported on current taking a massively long-term view. So that means it's still got a way to go. And it may well be that you end up with a mixed model. You know, the cost of the TV platforms is a sunk cost in the main, and they have certain advantages which the internet. So I see the two sort of working together, but I would think it's another 5 to 10 years away before you're going to see it.
TSC 1.0 came out, you know, with a digital transmission. Each of the over-the-air broadcasters were provided a 19.2 amount of bandwidth to transmit. They ended up subdividing that, a lot of them, rather than doing one 1080p, they did multiple 720p's so that they could start increasing the ad revenue across channels. But interestingly, the subs that they chose, things like TV and Grit TV, Justice TV, it turns out almost all of the over-the-air broadcasters are using those same sort of sub-channels. And those are geared toward a very aging demographic. So I think you're spot on in terms of the types of content that people are still consuming, minus sports, minus breaking news, minus the presidential debates, the type of content on traditional television, at least in the States, seems to be geared toward a much older demographic.
Okay.
Is that true, do you think, in Europe as well?
I think it is true. I mean, I think that I think there's not many examples of sort of financially viable OTT operators who are financially viable on a year-on-year basis. I think there's quite a few of them who are doing really well and making enormous progress on the back of quite solid financing. But of course, if that financing wasn't there, you know, it would be a challenge. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think on the other hand, you know, many distribution platforms, streaming distribution platforms, are valued at enormously high numbers. So if you're not making the money on the P&L, maybe you're making the money on the share price. I don't know.
Possibly, yeah. Florence, you mentioned, I don't know if your fire alarm's still going off. I'm assuming it's probably not. But you mentioned before we started the show about standardization, and how standardization is something that the publishers you work with really sort of yearn for.
Yeah.
The industry traditionally has had, you know, format wars, player wars, etc. What would standardization do for your customers?
I think it would just put everyone on that equal playing field and just give them a point to start at, because that's a huge hurdle for them. And like being so small, they just, you know, don't have often the resources. Even some of the bigger ones just don't understand the resources that would to dedicate what's needed to dedicate to it, but how much easier it would make it for them. So I think that would really just open up VOD, the whole market to them, and get them started at a point where they could actually start seeing, you know, start distributing on a larger scale and start being able to make impact and start getting really a foot industry, because right now they're still struggling. It's still new tech to them.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
Dom,
Sorry,
what's your general sense
Florence.
in terms of standardization?
Sorry, Tim. Florence, do you mean technical standardization, or do you mean standardization in terms of a more broader reach than pure technology? Florence?
Sorry.
Do you mean technical?
I didn't hear that last part.
Do you mean technical standardization, or do you mean more broadly standardization of?
I think we've lost.
Oh, I think we might have lost the audio there. Tim, can you hear me?
For me, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're fighting.
Yeah. What Dom was Florence, was whether you're talking about technical standardization or some other form of standardization.
Technical. So for instance, like you know how there's so many different there's HLS, there's the different technical standards for that. So I think that is even that small part is something that they need to that they need help around, that they need to get on board with. And if we had like one standard out there, that would give so many of them the opportunity to get into the market and to be able to play. Not obviously not compete with the bigger ones, but just be able to play in the market a bit more.
And Dom, this is my soapbox, because I think HLS was a broken solution to begin with, and yet it's become the industry standard.
Yeah.
To Peter's point, Florence, I guess, do we need to look at OTT more like TV in terms of if we could get the cost the same, whether it's just distributed to 100 people or 100,000 people, and would that be beneficial to the publishers in terms of pricing?
Yeah, you know what? I kind of do think so, because we've seen TV, the model, it does work, but it broke along the way as, I don't want to say greed, but it kind of broke along the way as we continue to force people to buy more and more and more to kind of not get exactly what they wanted. So I think what OTT offers is a bit more of a solution in terms of I get the content that I want specifically. But
and ironically, here in the States, the 1993 Communications Act actually allowed for unbundling of cable, but
yeah,
what it didn't do is price per channel, and then cable companies charge you the same for 12 channels as they did for 25. So
yeah, and so I think we need to kind of go back to where it started, but then correct those mistakes that were made with cable along the way.
So I'm just going to throw a quick one in here. So Peter sent his apologies, but he's clearly got some critical anti-piracy emergency going on at Wimbledon, or maybe not. But he's had to step away, so he's passes his apologies for having to step away a little early. But I'm just going to go a little bit more techie than we have been. But I don't know if you picked up that Xilinx acquired NG Codec over the last month. There was an announcement last week about this, and I do think that there is something of a step change coming in the hardware provisioning particularly in content delivery and encoding space. I think that there's something of a step change coming in the efficiency of silicon, the efficiency of available compute resources to deliver streaming and so on and so forth. So we were doing some sizing exercises internally here about the number of servers we would need to use to host the Super Bowl. And by my estimation, that number's come down by at least one, if not two, orders of magnitude as FPGA is starting to become available in more infrastructure and so on. And I think that will ultimately, for a short while, be reflected in the profit margins of the CDNs. But as price pressure always continues in the CDN space, I think that will again further drop the underlying costs of streaming, which that may hurt the industry, to be honest, but it's certainly certain parts of it. But I think we're going to see some step change. Firstly, question to both of you: do you agree with that sort of that sentiment that there's going to be some further step changes in the industry? And secondly, aside from FPGA, are there any that come to mind that you guys feel are on the horizon?
Florence, I'll let you go first on that.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm not that technical, so I actually will defer to you on that, because I feel like you'll have more to contribute to that.
Okay.
Nicely volleyed. Nicely volleyed.
Dom, FPGA, massive parallelization is a very good thing, but fundamentally, we're still stuck with issues around DCT and the way that it sort of handles block encoding and that type of thing. Throwing more firepower at it to reduce the number of servers, absolutely, that makes sense. And I could see a day where we'd have multiple FPGAs tied to. In fact, there are a couple companies out there doing an FPGA tied to a 10 gig PHY or physical connection that are small enough to put in something maybe just slightly bigger than the Raspberry Pi, and be able to do very good 4K, encodes and push out across the 10 gigabit per second connection. Having said that, obviously you've got the cost of the unit itself, which isn't outrageous for what it does from a technical standpoint. But I do wonder if we're at one of those inflection points in the industry, like we were a couple of years ago, where people started putting multiple Celeron chips or multiple Atom chips into a single chassis that essentially allowed low power parallelization, not massive like an FPGA, but from a cost standpoint, getting it to the point where it was fairly robust. And in fact, one of the companies that did that, they had Fire in their name. They were bought by Facebook to be a solution for multiple encodes.
Oh no, it wasn't Moonshot, was
Do you
it?
remember that?
Quickfire.
Quickfire, thank you. And they did demonstrations at a couple shows and were snapped up almost immediately, because what they were showing was the ability to do precisely what you're describing, shrink the number of physical units down into a smaller form.
That's right, because they were the first people to really get to grips with the Intel GPUs, and they burnt 9 of them onto a single motherboard, and they were competing with high density solutions from a couple of other vendors who were actually managing to fit 18 into instead of a 1U rack, they were fitting them into a 2 or a 4U rack. In fact, one vendor we use regularly stacks 48 Intel CPUs into a 4U rack, and that was the last I think that was the last significant step change. But I think FPGA coming through may well bring more. So to sort of segue on from that, I wonder, and this may be a little bit less technical, Florence. So hopefully can spur some comment. But I went blank on my thought. Oh no, the emergence of 8K and people pushing this resolution higher and higher to sell more TVs and sell more expensive production cameras and so on. I think it's been interesting, but I think the consumer's starting to get wise to it, and I think they're realizing that they don't get any benefit as a human being from 4K. Computationally, production wise, there's some benefit, but nobody gets any benefit in the average front room from 4K. So I think there's some degree of pushback coming in that space. So again, where do you think these limits are? Do you think that we're going to see 1080p? Really, everyone's going to settle back to 1080p. At which point we're going to see much more aggressive commoditization in the 1080p space, or do you think that we're going to still see this chasing the 8K, 16K, God knows how much K, atomic resolution in film? At which point we might as well just go back to celluloid, frankly.
Right.
I would be all for that, having an undergrad degree in motion picture production.
There you go. I do think it comes to a point where there's a good enough, right? Consumers know there's a good enough, and there's, like you said, even at 4K, they're not getting the benefits. So while there always be people who are excited and who want more and more for the masses, I think it is going to be a good enough point. So there's no one will be out there buying those 8K TVs and super excited about, or well, some people will, but not the masses. I don't think.
Personally, I tend to agree. Tim, any thoughts on that?
I mean,
I don't. When 1080p came out, everybody was like, "We don't need it," and then everybody got used to that as being the standard of quality. And then when 720p, when they watched 720p content or 480p content, it looked bad. 4K felt the same way. It felt too sharp almost. But now we're sort of used to that, and so the reason celluloid worked was it was as good as the eye or better. In fact, it was quite a bit better. And so the question is, where do we reach at that point on the on the digital side. And honestly, if you look at Apple's devices, the Retina devices, if you go back and look at an old iPhone,
Right.
it just looks really jagged, and you're like, how did I possibly read anything on this? When they got it to the number of pixels per inch, which is what we want to discuss as opposed to resolutions, when they got it to the proper number of pixels per inch, then it felt like paper or close to paper. And I think what we're looking for really in the industry is something that mimics what the eye sees from a visual capture standpoint. I don't think we need to go beyond 8K to get that. We might have to go to 11K, but once we reach that, at that point, it really, I think the expansion question becomes, do I give it to you on multiple angles so that you can see a TV that, you know, is curved,
Right.
that you can walk around and see different perspectives and like that. I think 8K gets us relatively close to film, not quite, but close enough that I don't think beyond that we're going to see a significant visual difference.
I think your point about like the angle, definitely the anglings, and that's more interesting. But you know, being, I guess, getting as close to film as possible. Yeah, you know, everyone does like that experience. So
when I first started in video conferencing, Dom, just to mention this, somebody wrote a report, and I read it in I think it was Harvard Business Review, that said that they had factored what it would take to create an hour and 20-minute long movie with 80 different angles on a hemispherical screen. And it turned out it was something like 6.7 at that point, which is still a pretty big number for us now, but not out of the realm of reason. And that was initial work that was being done by a company that ultimately became iPix, because they were doing hemispherical cameras and trying to figure out how to capture that way.
So being a true geek, going to your comments about paper, Tim, I have spent about an hour this week trying to work out which components I'm going to bring together to make my next phone, because Apple, I object to big phones. I'm still on a one of these, you know, a little iPhone SE. When this thing gets lost or dropped in a canal or whatever happens to my phone next time, then which is a different story. When that happens, then I fully intend to build my own phone using a $19 Omega chip, which has just come out with 4G, 5G support. But most importantly, I want to put an e-ink or an e-reader screen on it, a small e-reader screen. There's a few out in the Far East at the moment. They're highly legible, screen's always on, they're Android based, which is very easy to run on these sort of $19 chips. But they get 17 days standby time because there's no backlight in there. And you can read them really, they're pin sharp in daylight and so on. And I personally, that's the direction I want to go with my phone.
I still carry a Motorola Razr V3 20-year-old phone, flip phone, because it works beautifully.
Yeah.
And if my iPhone dies, I can just pull the chip out and stick it in that and know that I've got, you know, a week's worth of phone calls that I can make.
So I think there's a lesson in there that there is definitely a good enough point. You know, my new MacBook screen, it's clearly billions of times higher quality and resolution than my old MacBook Air was. But for some reason, it does my eyes in, whereas my Mac Air, I can stare at the screen far longer. I don't know what it is, even though the screen's...
It's funny that you say that, because I've got a MacBook Pro, and we got a MacBook Air for Michelle just the other day, and looking at that screen felt better to me than my higher resolution.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, any last thoughts to wrap up, guys? Because we're on the hour.
At the top of the hour.
Yeah. Any last thoughts to wrap up? What do you think the big news might be over the next 4 weeks before we're next on air? Any guess?
Goodness. Florence, I'll let you go first on that one.
Oh, geez, I'm not sure. You got me. I don't know what could be coming down in the next 4 weeks.
What do you think, Tim?
Obviously, as we get closer and closer to Disney launching its service, you know, there's the question of what Netflix will do, what Amazon will do. That's something that clearly we want to watch. And then just beyond the next episode we do is IBC in September.
Yeah.
And of course, talked about 8K, and even 12K, we'll see demonstrations there of some different solutions. So I think we're in a little bit of the summer lull, but I definitely think, keep your eye on Disney and some of the premium content.
For sure.
Others.
My guess is that IBC is going to be flooded with people saying AI-driven low latency AV1 live. That's my guess. Whether anyone's really doing it or not, I don't know. So, right. Well,
Makes a
listen.
nice chant.
Sorry, Florence, I cut you off there. Say again.
I said it makes a nice chant.
Exactly.
I'll be chanting it.
Buzzword bingo. Brilliant. Listen, Florence, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really appreciated. And sorry, it's
Thanks
been
for having me.
a little bit of a chaotic episode. This Thursday, July the 4th, has just been a little bit complicated for everyone, both sides of the water.
And Dom, it's probably because I didn't wear this tie.
Clearly.
If I had worn that, everything would have gone well because, America's great or something.
Well, I had I wish well, actually, no, I don't really wish, but I might have once upon a time had a Union Jack tie, but I'd have to burn it now because I'm not sure that there is going to be United Kingdom by the next episode. So that might be the next trend we have to predict. Anyway. Well, listen, thanks very much, everyone. Right. It's been brilliant to have you. And for the audience that are tuned in and listening, do join us live on the first Thursday of every month. We'll be back next month, and check the calendar for the schedules. It's been great to have you. Thanks once again.
Thanks, all.
Oh, got to get my outro button working. Even that's not working today. It doesn't want to let us finish.